It's no secret the Boston public school system has been struggling. It narrowly avoided a state takeover last year after the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education found it failed to meet a slew of goals set after the last state probe into the system. Among them, the department cited a lack of urgency in improving special education services. But now, Superintendent Mary Skipper, who took the helm of the BPS last year, is promising to make some sweeping changes. One of her main focuses, the district's long history of funneling Black and brown students into special education classes at much higher rates than their white peers. Superintendent Skipper recently told GBH, "There's no way I'm going to come in and be an effective superintendent and not deal with this straight up. So that's what I'm going to do." Joining me to discuss are Ruby Reyes, director of the Boston Education Justice Alliance, and Michael Krezmien, a professor of special education at UMass Amherst and the director for the school's Center for Youth Engagement. Ruby, you've heard promises before of help for the special education system. Can you boil down for us what the essential problem is that needs to be fixed from your perspective?
Well, I think most recently the Council of Great City Schools did another report on the things that could be fixed. Specifically, it almost mirrored what was written in 2009 in the 2009 report. So I think it's just a matter of, we're all kind of waiting for the proof in the pudding. As of right now, there's no pudding, there's no recipe, there isn't even a flavor chosen. And so I think for us, for myself, for many of our members, for families that have been in this process and heard these promises before, we're really frustrated and we're really at a very just really urgent state of needing some work to be done.
So, so let's look at some of the numbers that give people a little bit of the context for this. When you compare Boston and Massachusetts to the rest of the country, Boston's substantially separate rate, that's placing students in a substantially separate setting, and this is from a November 22 report by a nonprofit hired by the Boston Public Schools. Boston has a 29% rate, Massachusetts 14%, and the U.S. overall 13%. So, Michael, how do you explain these numbers? Does this seem striking to you? And you might really want to explain to people what substantially separate means for students.
Sure, yeah, it does seem striking. Substantially separate is an educational setting which has been removed from the access to the typical educational setting. So often these are segregated classrooms where students spend their day in an isolated classroom receiving instruction from special educators, or oftentimes separate schools, or often separate schools with specialized programs within them. And I would say that, to me, the biggest underlying kind of cause of high rates of kids in these settings is a failure of the educational system to effectively manage and educate the kids. So that the classroom settings are struggling, teachers are struggling, and instead of kind of revising the education, revising the curriculum, meeting the needs of those students, the easier option is to have them sent to another setting where they'll say this is a more specialized, environment that they can get better services and support.
So, Michael, explain to people, what is it that they lose by being carved out of the regular classroom?
I think it's a wide sway of things that get lost. First, I think access to that general education curriculum from content, instructors. So a person who's trained to be a math teacher teaching you math. But I think it's also a removal from the social structures of school, that they don't get access to the same types of special programs that kids might get. They might not have art class or music class. And I think it's broad and sweeping. I think the students who are in these segregated settings have a vastly different experience. And to be honest, it's very difficult to reintegrate them without a really substantial plan, for how they're going to meet the needs of these students in a typical education class.
So a particular aspect of Boston's public special education program impacts Black and Latino males. So let's look at some of the statistics that we have. Black males going into special education, 24% compared to their representation in the overall population of 14%. Latinos, 29% compared to their representation of 21%. And white students, 8% in special ed and very close match, 7% in the school system overall. Ruby, what does this say to you?
It says to me that Boston continues to have a legacy of institutional racism that it's historically had and historically has continued through policies, through placement of students, through, just throughout the entire system. I think the culture of the leadership and central office makes it difficult for families to have access to the resources that they need. And many times you see Black and Latino families being denied services or told, that they can't have certain things. And I think that's part of what makes it difficult for families to have access to the resources that they need for their children to be placed in the right settings.
So, Michael, can you explain how money is a part of this? Students, families with money can actually move to places where there's great special education. I've heard stories about lawyers who are hired by families to make sure that these individual educational programs, these sort of tailored programs to help their students, are done the right way. How does money play into all this?
Yeah, I think money and kind of sort of knowledge that can be obtained through some of the types of, elements you've just talked about, having an advocate who can help you, being able to hire an attorney who can walk you through the system. Special education is a very complex system, as Ruby points out. It's very difficult for parents to understand what's happening. There's not a lot of resources for parents to help them understand what is the best decision, what are the options available to us. And so you could imagine somebody who does have money and has the capacity to hire a special education advocacy attorney can get the services they need through that expertise, while others without those resources are left to sort of take what the district is providing and say, in an IEP process, it often is school and district dominated with relatively little voice from parents.
So you talk about the complexity of special education, Michael. Part of the assessment process to put a student into a special education program, it's somewhat subjective, really. It relies on the teacher. It can be impacted by bias. Can you explain how it is that it becomes a subjective process?
Yeah, I think there, especially when we're sort of talking about the problems that are being faced in a district like Boston, I think there's a range of issues going on. And I would say to start with, to sort of piggyback a little off of Ruby's point, I think that the education being provided to kids of color in their schools is not getting them up to the level that they need to be. And so these gaps in skills are misinterpreted as a disability, as opposed to we've failed to do our job in providing effective instruction. I think from that point on, there's we don't have a system that says here is the only way to identify a kid with a disability. It's a law that is pretty broad, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it doesn't give you here is the point-by-point steps that everybody follows. Instead, there's a lot of subjectivity. And just to point out, that law has not been reauthorized since 2004. So we're now talking about a law that sort of hasn't aged along with the ways that we can now measure student performance, the types of innovative assessments currently available to us.
And Ruby, there are a lot of students for whom English is a second language. How does that play into the problem?
Well, I think sometimes when a child, because they're supposed to offer native language literacy, and they don't necessarily do that as the beginning place, I think that's where students are misplaced. So they can be put into special ed, not realizing that it's just a matter of them needing to have English language literacy access. And so you see this this relationship between necessity and resources, and how important it is for families to know and be able to have access to that information. It's hard enough. We had one mother, for example, whose child needed door-to-door bus service because of a medical condition and had to obtain a lawyer to write a letter to get that simple thing. And so it is a difficult process. I think if you have, families whose first language is not English and aren't maybe as attuned to the complexities and understanding the complexities of accessing those resources in central office and navigating those spaces, it can be 2 and 3 times as hard.
We looked at the numbers that show the disproportionate numbers of Black students, Latino students, male students. Are there solutions, Ruby, that can be found to focus on these male students to better identify what is possibly a support that could be done in a classroom versus removing them from a classroom? Would having more teachers of color, more male teachers of color, be a help?
Absolutely. I think, the Garrity order calls for, which has never been met by the district or the city of Boston, calls for a 25% of Black teachers. I think there's not just a matter of hiring Black teachers, but really retaining them, making sure that they have the supports that they need. I would also say that we really pushed hard for ESSER funds to be put into hiring more reading specialists. A lot of times Black students and Latino students will have, reading needs.
Okay.
And those aren't
Right.
necessarily being assessed.
All right. Thank you, Ruby. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Ruby, Michael, thank you both very much.
Thank you, and have a great day.